So I had a lecture recently on the rationality of war, and my lecturer was describing war as being equivalent to a transaction where you buy a car. But he said it's more like buying a car where the salesperson is constantly smashing the windows of the car and you keep burning the money in your hands. Members of the College Historical Society, my name is Jack Sinnott. I'm here today to argue that there is no such thing as a just war. I'll be bringing two main points. Firstly, about how arbitrary wars are just naturally immoral, and then about how supposedly moral wars are still rooted in this kind of fundamental injustice, to justify the fact that the only war I support is the good old-fashioned class war. So war, I think, is kind of just obviously not a good thing. I think that no one, unless they are genuinely evil, actually wants wars to happen. I don't think anyone looks at a situation and thinks the best outcome here would be mass death and destruction. I think people come up with different justifications for war. War is usually justified, I think, as pragmatic, as this kind of necessary evil. So what I'm going to argue tonight is that war actually is not necessary and is thus never justified. So the way I see it, I think there are two sort of broad categories of war. There's arbitrary wars and, like, for want of a better word, kind of more serious wars that are sometimes kind of paradoxically called moral wars. And I think that arbitrary wars, kind of land disputes, power struggles, attempts to kind of expand a colonial empire, I think they clearly have no moral basis. They're a means for powerful people to increase their own power at the expense of unfortunate citizens forced to put their lives at risk for the sake of their leaders' whims. I don't think I have to do an incredible amount of work to justify to you that telling people to risk their lives for a cause that has no real meaning to them, just so that you can increase your own power with the threat of imprisonment if they say no, is a bad thing to do. I think it's quite clear that that is a bad thing to do. I think that those in power owe a duty of care to those they have power over, not to just make these arbitrary, these irrational decisions. So I think that these wars are quite obviously not just. But I think the more interesting question is about the second kind of wars, the more complicated types of wars, wars in response to atrocities, human rights abuses, global injustices, etc. And while I can accept that these wars are kind of less bad than the arbitrary wars I already discussed, I still don't think they are actually just. I'm going to explain why for the rest of my speech. So we live in a world which is made up in a very specific way, and which prioritizes certain things over others. So in the West, for example, competition is prioritized over cooperation, economic productivity is prioritized over happiness, money is prioritized over love. And globally, a similar process of prioritization, I think, takes place. In international politics, conflict is prioritized over diplomacy, self-interest prioritized over kindness, and maintenance of power prioritized over doing the right thing. And the result of these prioritizations, of this way that our society is kind of fundamentally constituted as it stands, I think that forces states to engage in these moral wars. Like, quite frankly, in the world as it is, I think war actually can be the only way to get things done. I think that negotiation, diplomacy, kind of basic human kindness, I think these things, in the way society is constituted as it is right now, are seen as kind of lesser tools in a policymaker's arsenal. I think that makes sense given how society is constituted at present. Like, in society as we know it, I think it is somewhat unlikely that a dictator is actually going to negotiate with you. I can see why you would justify these wars in society as it is. But I don't think that actually makes the wars themselves just. I don't think it even necessarily makes these wars necessary. Instead, I think that what it shows us is that society at large, in a kind of huge, pervasive sense, is corrupt. You know, within this society, war is a response that makes sense. But it's only within the framework of this world that really doesn't care about justice. You know, moral wars aren't actually the right thing to do. They're just the best thing to do given the circumstances. You know, I think that it's a sense of we're just kind of stuck with having to do a war in this kind of society that we live in. And I don't think that that makes wars themselves actually just. Yeah, but the important thing is that society doesn't actually have to be this way. This, I guess, is where the class war comes in. If we could reconstitute society, hypothetically, on an immense scale, so that power was not there to be abused, so that oppressor-oppressed relationships weren't a kind of fundamental part of how we organize things, then I think that there would actually be no need for these just wars. You know, and I think this probably sounds incredibly ambitious, and it's really easy for me to stand up and say, hey, why don't we just end end capitalism. But to a serf in feudal society, I think the idea of living in a republic seemed insane. Seemed like a kind of thing that you could never feasibly achieve. I think there's no reason why we can't just get together as a society and at least try to fix these things. Everything about the society that we live in is something that we, as human beings, have created. There's no reason at all that we can't change that if we just try hard enough. And I think that the benefits of this speak for themselves. War, at the end of the day, is just hugely irrational. It is smashing the car and burning the money. It's costly both in terms of actual state funds and human lives. The US spends like 3 times as much on defense as it does on, more than 3 times, on, healthcare. It's just not a good way to use our resources, both in terms of as people and in terms of, actual, resources. I don't think that war, we actually gain a whole lot out of it, and it's also incredibly uncertain. You don't know how long a war is going to last, what kind of weaponry the opposition is going to use, how the effort will be perceived domestically. Even from a policy-making standpoint, I don't understand why we constantly pick war. It's just a really bad decision, And on top of this, and I think this is a really important thing, war creates an environment in which cruelty becomes normalized. It becomes acceptable to just use violence to solve your problems. I think there's a reason why the line between liberation and occupation is a fine one that seems to get crossed a lot of the time. And I think there's also a reason why retaliations often look like atrocities. I think that war creates this environment where violence is just okay, and it's seen as constantly legitimate, and I don't think that that's a good thing. So we, on Government Bench, we reject the assertion that extreme violence is an inescapable fact of political life. We believe that society can change for the better and that war can become a thing of the past if only we try hard enough. And I think the first step on that road, however small, is to stop pretending that wars can be just, that wars can be moral, that wars can be righteous. Cruelty is cruelty, and we on the Government Bench reject cruelty. Please propose. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world of just war, only war, and nothing but war. We are all always at war. Or at least that was going to be my speech, and I was told I shouldn't make comedy speeches at serious debates. So if you find the next 7 minutes really dull, it's not my fault. A few parts to my speech. What is justice? What is war? And then why is war just? It's remarkably simple. So to begin with, what is justice? Now, you've all undoubtedly encountered through your extensive reading of Plato the definition of justice as harmony of the soul. Essentially, Plato thought that the song Lovely Day by Bill Withers was like the gold standard of justice. Alternatively, a definition of justice is like any action performed within the will of the state, but I feel like that's not a definition that we can use. I don't feel like we're talking about legal justice, because then any declaration of war by a legal state would be seen as a just war, and that doesn't seem to make sense to me. So if any of you have been anywhere near Kevin in the last week, you probably have heard his whole, you can read off the introduction to John Rawls' theory of justice and win any principle debate thing, which, although that's not true, it is kind of what I'm about to do. This is largely because I feel like Rawls outlines a reasonable characterization of justice that I find very appealing. It's essentially justice as fairness. I'm talking to my political philosophy professor, so I'm sorry if I get this wrong. And essentially justice as fairness, like two principles, equality of opportunity and also the greatest benefit to the least fortunate. And I feel like this does actually play into the idea of harmony of soul. I think we're inclined to feel like almost emotionally repulsed and distressed when we're presented with an instance of injustice in our lives. I feel like there's a natural satisfaction that we get whenever we see justice. I feel like as people with common sense, we don't necessarily need a definition of justice to know what justice is. There was a Harvard professor named Stephen Jay Gould who famously proved that there was no such thing as a fish, or at least that there was no definition of a fish. It's not like after he proved that there was no definition, he forgot what fish were and thought aquariums had been invaded by aliens. I feel like this is very similar to how we're able to understand justice. And this brings me to my second point. what is war, and specifically, obviously, war in the context of this debate. This clashes with what Jack's saying. I feel like it's entirely unfair to expect the opposition to stand over like deaths of millions of people and still call that a just war. It's unreasonable for us to like weigh any certain amount of death with any certain amount of anything. I feel like it's not a reasonable expectation. I think when talking about what a just war is, we're not supposed to be like retroactively examining war and say, was this war just, was that war just? What we should really be questioning is, was the reasons that a group of individuals had to go to war, were they just? The real question at hand is, are there cases where a group can go to war? It's not the war, the total thing, it's war through the lens of the individual group. And the reason I say this is because, firstly, this is why I think this question is most applicable. It's where we can pragmatically apply, it's where the question leaves the room. And secondly, because we have a position of objective neutrality in that we weigh the deaths on both sides equally. It's like, usually if someone's thinking about going to war, the aggressors aren't going to be like, oh no, all the people I'm trying to kill are going to die. Well, not that I would have any experience to know that, but I'm just assuming. But I feel like you have to, in order to actually give a useful answer to this question, you've got to look directly to the lens of those declaring war. Otherwise, the question has no actual use in the real world. And then this brings me to the third point. It's like war. What is it good for? War is undeniably a form of violence. I feel like we can find out what war is good for by examining instances in when violence can be justified. And I think the most common answer that we get from that is violence is justified in self-defense. And you can take that, I feel like you can expand that self-defense to things like key human rights. Things like liberty, freedom of expression, autonomy, property. But of course, like, this is within reason. If you're in a fight with your brother and he's got a lighter about to set fire to your bed, I feel like you're justified in kicking him, but probably not in committing fratricide. So there's like a level of reasonability that we have to adopt. But how can we extend this to justify acts of violence in groups? So let's say, like, you're a 6-year-old child, you're sharing a room with one of your siblings who's around the same age, and this brother who's failed to set fire to your bed, now is trying to barricade you into your room for some unknown reason. He's a troubled child. Now, as your 6-year-old self, your personal right to freedom is being infringed upon, but you don't have sufficient efficacy to stop him. He's bigger, he's stronger, he's either insane or extremely hormonal. So what can you do? How can you stop this threat? How can you defend your rights? For me, the obvious thing to do is to get your other sibling together and, like, throw Lego at him. I feel like you, but like, regardless of whether or not this works, the essential point is that you have the efficacy as two people to defend your right to fight as justice, and the level of like just you are as an individual carries. It's just your efficacy to actually achieve your goal. Your means have increased, but the level of justice that you have in making this action stays constant. And also, of course, I'm assuming that there's no higher power that we can appeal to. Like, there's no parents as a hypothetical example. But unless you obviously these kids are analogous to countries. But unless you think there's a really on-point interventionist God, I don't think we have a parental equivalent in real life if we were to carry this over as an analogy. So, as I've suggested, I feel like you can take this rationale to a much larger scale. In an instance where you have a state or any body that represents a large group of people, it is fair to say that this group can defend the human rights of these people in the same way these two kids were justified in protecting themselves from being locked into their room. Their justness stays the same, but their efficacy to achieve their goals increases. It follows then that equally violence on the part of a group is justified in situations where key human rights of those citizens that the group represents who cannot individually defend themselves are put into serious risk. The group enables these individuals to defend themselves in the same way that they would have, and it would be justified to do if it was only them versus one other person. And that is essentially why I believe it is possible to be a just war. Thank you. I urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank them for this speech, and I would like to call on John to continue the case.
Okay. Am I right to speak from here? Don't have to go here. Right. I want to start by just saying a bit about myself, not because I like talking about myself,
Does anybody have a watch that I could borrow, please? An old-fashioned one. Yeah, that'll do. That won't go blank on me.
No.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me, and I am going to oppose the motion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about dogs, I'm going to tell you about death, I'm going to tell you a little bit about pigeons, and then I'm going to embark on a philosophical and ethical treatment of war and just war. So before I start, I just want to quote Jack. Yeah, war, nobody wants a war, and I quote, unless they are actually evil. Okay? So I want you to hold that thought, unless they're actually evil. Okay, so what Jack does is give us the premise of the concept of evil, good and evil in the world that we live in. So let me tell you about the dog, and I should do this during my uninterrupted time. So I have 4 kids, one of whom has a neuromuscular disease, and he's a wheelchair user, and he's partially sighted, and he has a dog. His name is Duke. He's a large golden Labrador, big male retriever, and golden retriever. And Duke the dog helps him to get dressed and undressed. He takes off his socks. He helps him to take off his trousers. It's a form of natural physiotherapy and play. The dog turns on and off lights. The dog goes in. He can take the clothes out of the washing machine and put them into the dryer. The dog can activate the buttons in a lift. He'll act on command. He can recognize the symbols. The dog also, when he's in the social situation with Owen, makes the wheelchair disappear. And people who otherwise might be shy or afraid to say the wrong thing engage with Owen because the dog is there. And I talk to him about his dog. And so on a sort of a psychosocial level, Owen has thousands of social interactions that he otherwise wouldn't have because of the dog. Here's a quick question. Is he a good dog? Yeah, he's a good dog. Okay, enough about dogs. 24 years ago, I left Dublin Airport to go to the Middle East as an army officer, as a lieutenant in the Irish Defence Forces, as a peacekeeper. I never came back. The young man that went to Lebanon, I don't know, he's gone. Never came home. So I flew out to Lebanon, a night flight, 4.5 hours, 5.5 hours direct from Dublin to Beirut. Arrived in Lebanon in the winter of 1995. Hezbollah, the most fanatical Islamic resistance group in the Middle East, stepped up their attacks on Israeli positions in the Irish area of operations. This great untold story of the Irish overseas. Those early attacks in the winter of 1995 were essentially suicide missions because the Israelis had air superiority, they had weapon systems, direct and indirect fire systems that just completely overwhelmed Hezbollah in their attacks on what they call the occupying forces. But in the spring of 1996, under the direction of Sheikh Nasrallah and with aid from Iran, Hezbollah began to really improve their penetration on Israeli targets, and in what the military called the exchange ratio, began to kill members of the Israeli Defence Forces. And they also, from the Irish area of operations, launched indiscriminate attacks into Israel proper, into settlements like Kiryat Shimona, little towns on the Mediterranean coastline, killing innocent men, women and children. In response, the Israeli government launched a punitive operation against the people of South Lebanon called Operation Grapes of Wrath, straight from the Old Testament. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And they declared the whole of South Lebanon a free fire zone. And during the last 2 weeks of March and the first 2 weeks of April, in the Irish area of operations, the UN history and the battalion history record that approximately 200,000 separate airstrikes, helicopter gunship attacks, artillery strikes from Gates 112, 14 Alpha. I remember, I was there, I saw it. And in those attacks, they slaughtered hundreds of innocent men, women, and children. Old people, infants, babies. We were unable to stop the killing, but we did try to save some that were caught in the slaughter. It culminated in a massacre in a little village called Quana, where allegedly Jesus turned the water into wine, into the massacre in one incident of 117 men, women, and children. We were there that day. They were rendered in a structure on a UN position by a direct strike from artillery. The effect of high explosives on the body, the shockwave pulps internal organs, shatters bones. So for many of the victims, there wasn't a mark on them. For others then, further out from the blast centre, you have the burning effects of high explosives, where the clothes were completely burnt off in individuals and children. You also had, with the shockwave, limb separation, decapitation, horrific shrapnel injuries, soft tissue injuries. I don't know where to begin. One of the first people that the Irish troops met that day when we arrived on scene was an elderly lady. She was a grandmother. She was holding her grandson who was decapitated, an infant, and asking us in Arabic if we could find the baby's head so that the baby could be buried in rites consistent with those set out in Islam. I saw it. I was there. 24 hours later, I was walking up Grafton Street with my girlfriend. What's my point? There are evil people. To harness the genius of a nation, fast jet aircraft, the brightest and best young men and women in that society, to break things and kill people is the very expression of evil. And that, I would put to you, is what makes us human. That is one of the things that makes us human. It's one of the things that makes us different from any other species on the planet. Bring you back to the dog. Is he a good dog? Who opens the door and presses the bell and helps my child to dress and undress? No, he's not. He's just a dog. He's not capable of good or evil. He is a thing en soi, in and of itself, incapable of moral reflection, incapable of existential action. And all of the moral philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, John Stuart Mill, the whole lot of them, say that what makes us human, the very thing that makes us human, is the capacity for altruism, the capacity for good, the capacity to existentially react to evil. And I think that what you oppose, and I admire you for it, is evil in the world. And what I would oppose the motion is rest on the intellectual fulcrum as set out by you, Jack, that we must, in cases of existential acts of evil, we must oppose and defend ourselves. That is a just war. For example, is there such a thing as an evil pigeon? It's just a pigeon. The same with the dog. However, people are capable of existential acts of evil. And according to philosophers such as Paulo Freire, the pedagogy of the oppressed is to restore our humanity by taking action and matters into our own hands, only in extremis and as a last resort. But we must reserve the right to defend ourselves. You described such a disturbing phenomenon in the concentration camps and in the death camps and the work camps of a woman whose legs were bound together when she gives birth. Surely, in the face of such evil, as human beings, as citizens, we have the right to react to such evil and to take matters in our own hands in those situations in order to render and to reaffirm our humanity and our capacity for altruism and for good. Now, as a young man, as an army officer in the Middle East, witnessing the killing of children, that for me was the end of the world. And how appropriate for a boy educated in the 1970s and the 80s in Ireland, with the Christian Brothers, to have an epiphany like that amongst the olive groves and the lemon groves of South Lebanon, in the Holy Land, to realize the very essence of man's inhumanity to man. Now, I don't speak to you from an ivory tower, from some sort of theoretical aspect. I have been and I've seen it, what the Americans call seeing the elephant. I have seen at first hand, first order construct of reality, what people are capable of and what evil is in the world. And it is the one thing that makes us human, the ability to act altruistically. So I do believe there is a just war. And finally, I would say to all of you in the room, we have a gentleman in the White House. We have another individual in Moscow. And we have other actors in the political sense globally. That means that your generation is possibly the first in many generations that will witness a conventional war in your lifetime. And that will be the manifestation of patriarchy and evil. And you must take action. You must go to war against this. And in the spirit of jihad, as set out in the Quran, begin by protesting, as John said. Do not allow your fate to be dictated to you by the powers that be that are extant, for they are evil. Thank you.
motion is defeated. Motion is defeated.
See if I can get entirely of this speech before my daughter gets there. Okay, so I'm going to actually have a little bit longer talking about it, so this will be good. Got a couple of things I want to say, and I'm hopefully going to pick up on a lot of things that we've already heard in these speeches, which are really interesting, really comprehensive. I want to pick up on Jack's comments about sort of his characterization of the world and sort of being generally terrible and awful. So there's a theme kind of running through a lot of this about optimism and pessimism and human nature. We saw both sides of that right now in Tom's speech about sort of the capacities that we have for good and evil. I want to pick up on John's point about rhetoric, the rhetoric of war. Right? When we go to war, what kind of claims do the actors actually make? I think it's a very interesting point to know that they always appeal to some kind of justification. Just war is an important sort of requirement, regardless of their actual motivations. So unless we assume that all of the states that go to war are being honest, right, we know that plenty of them are lying when they say that they're going with right intentions and adhering to all these various conditions of traditional just war theory. I also want to talk about, some of the speeches we heard some traditional elements of just war theory, right? So Samir mentioned war as a last resort. Ellen sort of said a lot of things explicitly about just war theory. Also want to touch on something Ashlyn said about sort of the connection between theory and practice, right? We have just one theory, but maybe we don't have to put them into practice. Okay, so hopefully you'll see some of the connections in a second. So I started thinking about this as a philosopher with my philosopher hat on, and I thought the question was a bit weird. Right? So that we should just think of, should we or shouldn't we believe in the possibility of just war? Seems weird from a philosophical perspective because it seems like, well, of course there could be just war. And the really interesting philosophical work, it might seem, is to figure out, well, what would a just war look like? What conditions would have to be met in order for us to say that something is just? Because the nice and awful thing about being a philosopher is you can just sit down in your chair and stroke your beard and think about these things in the abstract and not have to worry too much about how they affect actual people's lives. So you can take just war as this really abstract concept and sort of work through it in your head and figure out what you think. So if that was what I was interested in doing, I was thinking, well, this question doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So then I was thinking, well, maybe there's a different way in which it makes sense. So sometimes when we think about concepts, like the concept of a just war, or any kind of concept in philosophy, right, it's worth thinking about what it is we actually gain from having that concept. What do we want the concept to do? What do we want it to explain? Once we have like a really good theory of just war, what's the upshot? Is it just something that's going to be confined to textbooks and classrooms, or is it something that is going to influence people's behavior? If you're a political philosopher, at least sort of in principle, you have to be in some sense concerned with this practical question. So we might think, or we might ask rather, not whether there are just wars or not, or even whether there could be just wars, right, that really abstract philosophical stuff, but we might think, well, is the actual idea of a just war itself useful, and if so, why is it useful? Might it be harmful, and if so, why might it be harmful? So I'm very worried tonight, so that's kind of appropriate, because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of give you two options, right, and see what you think. And I'm going to nudge you towards one, and it'll be really obvious which one I'm nudging you towards, but officially, I'm going to stay neutral. So, let me tell you a little bit something about the philosophical theory of just war. So at the moment, the debate among philosophers who are interested in just war theory falls into two very, very broad camps. So on the one hand, you have what we could call the traditional view of just war theory. As the name suggests, right, this is a really, really old view. It's so old, many of the terms you still see in the debates are sort of still in the original Latin. Right? They talk about jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and jus ex bello, and all these things. Right? This conception of war, this sort of traditional theory of just war, it's appropriate this is a historical society. Right? It's a kind of historical conception. You have your king, and he's against the other king, and they have their armies, and there are certain obligations that the people owe to the war that they're going to fight. And it is almost like a game, right? That there are certain rules that just war theory tries to capture. And the interesting thing about this traditional view is it's kind of symmetrical in a sense. So once it sets up these rules, and once you kind of adhere to these rules, the position of sort of the two opposing soldiers on the battlefield is a kind of moral equality. The traditional view says, say, the Ally versus the Nazi. Right? It says the Ally is morally entitled to kill the Nazi, but also on the battlefield, the Nazi does not do something morally wrong in killing the Ally. There's a kind of equality there. Right? They're both playing by a sort of agreed upon set of rules. Now, that was the sort of the traditional conception, and the references we heard tonight in some of the ways draw from that kind of traditional conception in terms of the kinds of criteria that were mentioned. Right? So we have things like, do you have the right intention? Is the war effort sort of a proportionate response? Is it a last resort? Right? These kinds of things are the sort of boxes you have to tick in the traditional view if you want to wage a just war. So Aquinas comes along and writes a bunch of stuff. A bunch of other people come along and try to defend this, people like Michael Walzer and so on. But then in the last 20 or 30 years, you have a different view emerging in the debate, right, which we could call a revisionist view, or a reductionist view, or maybe even an abolitionist view. So the difference between these two views is the new view says, actually, there's nothing special about the morality of war as such. Because on the traditional view, what it's trying to do is to set up this sort of special sphere of morality. Ordinarily, we interact with each other, there are a certain set of rules that apply, but there's something special about war. The stakes are so high, it involves sort of trying to avert catastrophes. Maybe we can do things in war we normally wouldn't be entitled to do. Maybe there are certain circumstances in which we can proceed and cause the deaths of civilians, for example. Another area where it matters is if you think about the relationships between the soldiers and the people commanding them. Maybe in war there are sort of special permissions that soldiers have to sort of trust that the people above them know what they're doing, whereas outside of war you might think there are stronger obligations on them to sort of do sort of epistemic work and find out what's going on in the circumstances. So the reductionist view, the sort of newer view, says, sure, we can talk about just war, but don't make the mistake of thinking that there's some special sphere of morality that only applies once all these boxes have been ticked. On the revisionist view, or the reductionist view, it says, war is just morality of self-defense, just scaled up. So some of the, in particular the last speaker, Maggie, I noticed, and this was true for some of the other speakers, when you were talking about sort of the reasons why wars might be just, you talk about self-defense and all of these things, a question you can ask yourself is, well, can we tell that story? Can we get the right result? Can we capture our intuitions without necessarily implying that something special or mysterious happens or emerges once we actually sort of tick this box and sort of war is on? Right? So, which one should you choose between these two views? Right? Should you go with the traditional view that says there's something special about war, certain moral rules no longer apply, and maybe certain new types of rules kick in? Or should you think that there's nothing morally special about war, once we have our sort of ordinary theory of morality, we just scale it up and apply it? So here's one reason you might have to choose one over the other. The practical effects of which of these theories you choose is that if you go with the traditional view, it's more permissive in terms of what it allows people to do. It allows people to, by appealing to this concept of a just war, by appealing to these traditional rules, it allows them to do things that we ordinarily wouldn't allow for, except that we've ticked the box that this is war. On the reductionist or the abolitionist view, you don't get that. You just get to do whatever you would ordinarily get to do, just in sort of a different context, but in the context of war. So in that sense, it's more restrictive. And so I'd like to close then by bringing this back to one of the first themes I mentioned, which is in terms of how optimistic or pessimistic you want to be about the world. So think about the world around you, think about the way actual states go to war, think about the real practice of things that happen around you, think of our capacity for good, think of our capacity for evil. And ask yourself, would it be better for us to endorse a concept that makes it easier for people to go to war, or would it be better for us to endorse a concept that makes it more difficult? And I think your answer to that question should tell you something about whether you should prefer the traditional view, which is more permissive, or the reductionist view, which is more restrictive. I'd like to thank you again for the great speaking.